Jesus gives us a recipe for love that sounds impossible. Love your enemies, give without expecting anything back, forgive without limits. If we tried to do this alone, we'd fail. But what if Jesus is inviting us into a community, a kitchen where we learn, fail, and grow together? In today's message, we explore how loving like Jesus isn't about perfection, but about practice. It's a rhythm we learn in community, one act of grace at a time. Let's step into the lab of love and see how God makes the impossible possible.
So I wonder what would happen if Jesus gave us a recipe for love that included ingredients like love your enemies, commit to anyone who asks and turn the other cheek, and then said, bon appetit. Most of us would stare at that recipe and say, this is impossible. And we'd be right. If we try to cook it alone, but what if Jesus isn't asking us to be solo chefs? What if he's inviting us into a kitchen, a community where we chop, stir, and taste this whole stuff together, even when we burn the bread? The continuation of our gospel reading from last week from the Gospel of Luke. Jesus gives us commands that don't just stretch our hearts, they snap our pride like a rubber band. Love your enemies. Give to those who ask. Do not judge. Those aren't spiritual suggestions. They're a call to a love so bold that it can't be lived out in isolation. It needs a laboratory, a community where we experiment, fail, and discover grace. Today, we're stepping into that lab to see how God will use us, the messy, misfit, hot mess people around us, to make God's impossible love possible. Let's start with Jesus' opening line. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. On paper, it sounds really noble. It sounds good, even maybe easy. But when the rubber meets the road, it's really hard. We want to freeze out the coworker who stabs us in the back. We want to judge the neighbor who annoys us. We want to keep our coats, our time, and our forgiveness to ourselves. This is where community becomes God's mirror. Think of St. Francis of Assisi for a minute. Our prayer of the day was attributed to him as words that are often very needed. And he is probably most known for his love of animals and nature, and the famous quote attributed to him, preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words. Francis took this sort of life that Jesus describes here very, very seriously. In fact, he used to get in trouble for how quickly he was willing to give away his clothes to others. His abbot one day said, "Stop giving your coat to every beggar in need." So Francis obeyed, right? Sort of. He'd tell the shivering stranger, "I can't give you my coat, but you could take it from me." The rule exposes limits. He couldn't follow Jesus and please everyone. He needed grace. And that's the gift and the grind of community. It's where someone will curse us, demand our coat, and ask for help when we're exhausted. It's where we realize that we can't do this. But that's the point. Community strips away the idea that we're good enough on our own. It humbles us. It drives us to pray, God, I need your love here because mine's run out. Jesus doesn't stop at exposing our limits. He invites us into a new rhythm. He says, do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that? This isn't a one-time act of kindness. It's a daily discipline, like learning a dance where the steps feel awkward at first. And community? Well, it's the rehearsal space where we practice that rhythm of love until it becomes second nature. Take St. Francis again. When his abbot banned him from giving his coat away, Francis didn't quit. He pivoted, like we're doing this morning. Take it from me, he would say. It wasn't trivial. It was creative faithfulness. The rule forced him to ask, how can I love more generously, not less? And in the same way, community trains us. That person who keeps asking for help, well, they're teaching us to give to everyone who asks. The friend who disappoints us, they're our chance to lend, expecting nothing in return. Because here's the thing, love isn't a single moment, it's a skill. Love isn't a sentiment, it's a skill. And like any skill, it takes repetition. In isolation, we'll default to what is easy, loving the lovable, giving when it's convenient. But in community, we're pushed to love when it's costly, forgive when it's awkward, and serve when we're tired. And every time we turn the cheek, it's a rep in the gym of grace. So this week, don't just think about Jesus' words, try them. Forgive that small offense without bringing it up. Buy coffee for the coworker who gets under your skin. When it feels unnatural, remember you're not failing. You're learning a new rhythm. In this community, well, we're here to say, let's try that again, together. Jesus ends with a promise in our gospel reading. Give, and it will be given to you. Pressed down, shaken together, and running over. But this isn't just a solo act, it's a symphony. One person loving an enemy is a spark. A community living this way, that's a wildfire. And Jesus says, love your enemies, and you will be children of the Most High. See, friends, when we love together, the world doesn't see our determination, they see God's heart. Imagine a church so known for their radical generosity that people will say they don't judge, they just give. A church where forgiveness isn't, a church where forgiveness isn't just prayer, it isn't just a word, it's routine. This is the measure that Jesus talks about. Our collective love becomes a tidal wave of grace, far bigger than anything that we could do alone. So what's holding us back? Fear. The fear that if we give too much, we'll run empty. But Jesus flips the script. The measure you use will be measured to you. When we pour out love as a community, God refills us, not just individually, but through one another. That's the miracle of community. Your small act of mercy plus my awkward act of forgiveness plus their risky generosity equals a revolution that the world can't ignore. Here's some good news. Jesus' words in Luke 6 aren't a test that we have to pass. They're an invitation that we get to try. An invitation to stop pretending like we've got this love thing figured out and start leaning into the one place where Jesus's and God's commands are possible. Community. This week, join the experiment. Pray for one enemy, not a generic prayer, name them. Give one gift without keeping score. A meal, a kind word, a coat. Bring your story here. Share with someone in this church where you're struggling or celebrating. Because the lab only works when you show up, not as experts, but as practitioners. When we fail, we remind each other of God's promise. The measure you give is the measure you get back. Not because we're perfect, but because God is generous. The world, dear friends, has enough lone rangers. So for us, let's be a people who love hotly, messily, and together. The lab is open. Let's get to work. Amen.
That's this week's episode of Peace Lutheran Sermons podcast. Don't forget to join us next week for another episode. Thank you for listening.